A Shahab 3 just hit Haifa. Not a military outpost in the desert, not a radar installation on a hilltop. Haifa, Israel's third largest city, its primary northern port, its last functioning major seaport after Ben Gurion was closed, and the location of the Elbit Systems manufacturing complex that became Israel's most critical surviving defense production facility the moment Iran destroyed Rafael weeks ago. One missile, one city, and in a single strike at 9:34 tonight, Iran has simultaneously eliminated Israel's last maritime gateway to the outside world, its second major defense manufacturing hub, and its largest petroleum refining infrastructure. I'm going to tell you exactly what was hit, why the concentration of strategic assets inside Haifa's port and industrial district makes this the most economically and militarily devastating single strike of this entire conflict, and what a campaign that has now destroyed Israel's primary air gateway, its primary sea gateway, and both of its major weapons production facilities means for a country that can no longer manufacture or import what it needs to continue defending itself. Stay with me, because the strategic situation after 9:34 tonight is categorically different from anything that existed before it. Let me start with the port, because the port is where the full weight of what Iran destroyed tonight becomes impossible to overstate. The port of Haifa handles approximately 60% of Israel's total import and export container volume under normal conditions. Under the conditions of this conflict, with Ben Gurion's runway cratered and commercial aviation to Israel effectively terminated, the port of Haifa has not been functioning as Israel's largest seaport. It has been functioning as Israel's only remaining gateway to the outside world in any meaningful logistical sense. Everything that previously moved through a combination of air and sea freight shifted entirely to what could arrive through Haifa's container terminals the moment Ben Gurion went dark. Medical equipment, pharmaceutical supplies that Israel does not produce domestically at sufficient volume, food imports that supplement domestic agricultural production, military hardware components, interceptor parts, radar replacement systems, electronic warfare equipment, all of it rerouted through Haifa when the air corridor closed. The port was not a backup to Ben Gurion. After Ben Gurion's closure, it became the primary lifeline, and tonight the Shahab 3 warhead that detonated in the port district at 9:34 reached the crane systems that load and unload container vessels, the fuel storage that powers port logistics equipment, the control infrastructure that coordinates vessel movement through the approach channels, and the pilot station infrastructure that guides ships into berth. The port of Haifa is not damaged tonight. It is not operating at reduced capacity. It is not open with restrictions. It is closed. And the vessels that were approaching Haifa with cargo Israel cannot afford not to receive are sitting offshore looking at a fire where the port lights used to be. The restoration timeline for Haifa port to a level of operational capacity that compensates for Ben Gurion's continued closure is not measured in days. Crane systems destroyed by a ballistic warhead detonation are not repaired. They are replaced. Approach channel integrity following a major detonation in a port district requires hydrographic survey before vessels of commercial draft can safely navigate it. Control infrastructure rebuilt from direct missile damage requires systems integration and testing before it can coordinate the complex vessel traffic that a major container port handles. The minimum realistic timeline for restoring meaningful port capacity is weeks. The timeline for restoring the full capacity Israel needs given Ben Gurion's continued closure is months. Israel just lost its last major connection to the outside world, not its last air connection, its last connection. The country that has been fighting this conflict is now, for the first time since it began, genuinely isolated from the supply chains and logistics corridors that sustain both its civilian population and its military campaign simultaneously. But if you think losing the last gateway is the worst of what happened in Haifa tonight, stay with me. Because what Iran did to Israel's defense manufacturing capacity with this single strike compounds every previous military production loss in ways that the port damage alone does not capture. Elbit Systems is one of Israel's 3 major defense companies, alongside Rafael and Israel Aerospace Industries. When Iran destroyed the Rafael facility weeks ago, the interceptor production line that Tamir resupply depended on went with it. That strike produced the battery depletion that eventually led to the uncontested drone swarm over Tel Aviv. What Rafael's destruction did to Israel's interceptor inventory, Elbit's Haifa complex destruction will do to the IDF's electronic warfare capability, its targeting systems, its drone platforms, and its command and control architecture, but on a timeline measured in weeks and months rather than days, which makes it easier to miss in immediate damage assessments and harder to recover from when the degradation fully manifests. Elbit's Haifa facility is the company's primary manufacturing hub for the electronic systems that every other military capability depends on to function. The targeting systems that guide Israeli precision munitions to their aim points. The electronic warfare suites that protect Israeli aircraft operating in an increasingly contested air environment. The drone platforms that have been providing intelligence and reconnaissance capability across every operational theater the IDF is managing. The command and control systems that have been holding the IDF's degraded command architecture together, despite the Hakkari strike and the progressive destruction of primary command infrastructure. All of that production capacity was concentrated in the Haifa complex that received the Shahab-3 warhead tonight. Iran has now destroyed both of Israel's primary defense manufacturing facilities. Rafael is gone. Elbit Haifa is gone. Israel Aerospace Industries, operating near the Ben Gurion area, remains the only major defense production complex that has not been directly struck. But its operations are degraded by the infrastructure disruption surrounding Ben Gurion's closure, and it was never the primary producer of the systems that the IDF most urgently needs right now. The structural shift in Israel's domestic defense production capability that tonight's Elbit strike completes is not reversible on any timeline relevant to the current conflict. You cannot rebuild a destroyed defense manufacturing complex during the conflict that destroyed it. The IDF will continue to operate the systems Elbit produced until those systems fail or are expended. When they fail or are expended, there is no domestic production pipeline to replace them. That is the trajectory Iran's sequential destruction of Rafael, and now Elbit Haifa has locked in. And what happens next with Israel's fuel supply is where tonight's strike adds a third simultaneous crisis on top of the gateway closure and the defense manufacturing destruction. And it's the dimension that will affect every Israeli civilian most directly in the days ahead. The Bazan Oil Refinery Group, Israel's largest petroleum refining complex, was co-located with the port infrastructure that the Shahab-3 struck at 9:34 tonight. Bazan converts crude oil into the fuel products that every functioning system in Israel depends on to operate. Aviation fuel for the military aircraft that are still flying, diesel for the generators powering hospitals, emergency services, and the critical infrastructure that has been running on backup power since the grid strikes, petrol for the military and civilian transport systems moving personnel, supplies, and casualties across a country under sustained attack. All of that refining capacity was concentrated in the Bazan complex. The fire that ignited when the warhead reached Bazan's fuel storage infrastructure at 9:34 is not a fire that Israel's firefighting services will control quickly. Refinery fires burn at temperatures and with chemical complexity that require specialized suppression equipment and techniques. Israel's firefighting capacity was not fully equipped for a major refinery fire before this conflict began. The supply constraints of the preceding weeks have not improved that equipment availability. The fire burning in Haifa tonight will burn for days. While it burns, refining capacity is offline. When it is eventually extinguished, the infrastructure it consumed will not be repaired. It will need to be rebuilt. Israel has lost its fuel production capacity at the same moment it lost its last import gateway. Fuel that cannot be refined domestically and cannot be imported through a functioning port is fuel that does not exist. The generators running the hospitals, the vehicles moving the supplies, the aircraft conducting the operations, all of them are now drawing down on whatever refined fuel reserves exist in Israel's strategic storage. When those reserves are depleted, the systems they power stop. The Shahab-3 itself carries a strategic message that the physical damage assessment alone does not fully convey, and that message deserves direct analytical attention. The Shahab-3 is not a generic ballistic missile in Iran's inventory. It is Iran's designated nuclear delivery system. It is the missile that was used in the earlier Dimona strike, whose warhead contents the Israeli government has refused to publicly characterize since the moment it landed. The government's silence about what that warhead contained produced one of the most consequential information gaps of this entire conflict, a gap that the international monitoring community has been attempting to fill independently while the Israeli government maintained its concealment posture. Now that same missile system has been used against Haifa. Not against a desert research facility with a controlled perimeter and a security architecture designed to manage exactly the kind of strike it received, against a civilian and industrial city of 280,000 people that was fully awake and populated at 9:34 on a Tuesday evening. The official statement confirms a missile struck the port district and that emergency services are responding. It does not characterize the warhead. It does not address whether the explosion was produced by a conventional payload or something that requires a different category of civilian protective response. That silence is not new. It is the same silence that followed Dimona. But the population it is being applied to this time is not a restricted facility with cleared personnel and radiation monitoring infrastructure. It is 280,000 civilians breathing the night air of a city where a Shahab-3 just detonated and whose government is telling them nothing specific about what it carried. Stay with me. because the international monitoring response to tonight's Haifa strike is already developing in ways that are going to make the government's silence increasingly difficult to maintain. The Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization Monitoring Network, the same network that detected elevated radionuclide readings following the Dimona strike, has stations operating across Cyprus, Turkey, and Greece. Those stations are collecting atmospheric data right now. The readings they produce in the coming hours will provide the first independent characterization of what the Shahab 3 delivered to Haifa's port district that does not depend on the Israeli government choosing to share information it has consistently withheld. The gap between what those monitoring stations may detect and what the Israeli government has communicated to the 280,000 people living in Haifa and the surrounding communities is the gap that defines the civilian protection failure this government has been running since the first Dimona strike. Haifa's population is not waiting for CTBTO data to make decisions about whether to open their windows tonight. They are making those decisions right now based on the information their government has provided them, which is nothing specific. The fire is visible. The smoke column is rising, the smell of a major industrial fire is in the air across the city, and the guidance the population has received is the standard conflict shelter guidance that was written for a conventional missile threat environment and has not been updated to reflect a Shahab 3 strike on a major industrial city whose warhead contents have not been publicly characterized. The Shahab 3 striking Haifa, rather than a military installation, also carries a geopolitical signal that every government watching this conflict must now process. Previous Iranian strikes in this campaign targeted infrastructure whose military or strategic function provided at least a framework within which allied governments could position their continued support for Israel's right to self-defense. A nuclear research facility, a military airport, an air defense production complex. These targets exist within an analytical vocabulary that government communications teams can work with even when the strikes are devastating. A ballistic missile detonating in the port district of a major civilian city at 9:34 in the evening while the population is awake and present does not exist within that vocabulary. The international response arriving tonight is being driven by the civilian character of the target in a way that previous strikes did not generate with the same immediacy and the same political weight. France, Germany, the United Kingdom, the European allied governments that have been managing their domestic political support for Israel throughout this conflict are now managing a news environment in which the story is a major Israeli city on fire, 280,000 civilians breathing industrial smoke, and a government that will not tell its population what the missile that started the fire actually carried. And what happens next to the Netanyahu government's domestic political position is where the compounding consequences of tonight's strike reach their most acute expression. Because Haifa is not a city that processes as distant infrastructure to Israel's civilian population the way that Dimona or a radar installation does, Haifa is Israel's third largest city. It is a city that every Israeli knows, that hundreds of thousands of Israeli families have personal connections to, that has been defined throughout this conflict's preceding weeks as the part of the country that had not yet been directly targeted at civilian scale. That status ended at 9:34 tonight. And Haifa carries a specific symbolic weight in Israeli civic life that makes its targeting more politically resonant than a comparable strike on purely industrial or military geography. Haifa has historically been Israel's most integrated city, the urban environment most frequently cited as evidence that Jewish and Arab citizens can share civic space, economic life, and community institutions without the tensions that define that relationship elsewhere in the country. The Shahab 3 did not strike one community or the other. It struck the shared industrial infrastructure that underpins both communities' economic existence simultaneously. The social dimension of that targeting will not produce an immediate visible consequence in the hours after the strike, but it adds pressure to a civic fabric that has been under sustained stress throughout this conflict, and that the government has been managing with the same combination of information suppression and narrative control that has characterized its handling of every other dimension of this crisis. The Netanyahu government's political position tonight is the most precarious it has occupied since this conflict began, and that assessment needs to be made against the full weight of everything that has preceded this moment. The corruption proceedings that were applying domestic pressure before the first Iranian missile was fired, the American military withdrawal that removed the external support architecture, the Ben Gurion closure that ended the air connection to the outside world, the Dimona strikes whose damage was never disclosed, the drone swarm that reached Tel Aviv uncontested with empty batteries, the water infrastructure destruction that left millions without supply. And now a Shahab 3 in Haifa's port district at 9:34 on a Tuesday evening that has simultaneously closed Israel's last functioning gateway, destroyed its second major defense manufacturing complex, eliminated its primary petroleum refining capacity, and put 280,000 civilians in a city breathing the smoke of a warhead whose contents their government will not characterize. Each of those events individually was a crisis the government survived through a combination of narrative management and the political capital that Netanyahu has accumulated over decades of Israeli political life. Together, they constitute a cumulative structural collapse of every assurance the government gave its population about what this conflict would look like and how it would be managed. I have spent my career in uniform and decades since assessing how military campaigns reach their decisive points. The decisive point is not always a dramatic battlefield reversal. Sometimes it is the moment when the gap between what a government told its population this would be and what it actually is becomes too wide to bridge with any available communication strategy. The Israeli government told its population the airport was protected. It was struck. It told them the water supply was defended. It was destroyed. It told them Haifa was not a primary target. It was hit with a nuclear-capable ballistic missile while the city was awake. At each of those moments, the government's response was silence, followed by managed communication, followed by a narrative framework designed to contain the political damage. Tonight's silence about the Shahab 3 warhead is the same response applied to a situation where the population it is being applied to can see the fire, smell the smoke, and hear the absence of an honest answer from the government that is supposed to be protecting them. Iran did not just strike Haifa's port tonight. It struck the last assurance the Israeli government had left to offer its population about the boundaries of what this conflict would reach. Those boundaries no longer exist. The port is burning. The defense production is gone. The fuel is on fire. The gateway is closed. And the government that assured its population none of this would happen is silent about what the missile that made all of it happen actually carried. That silence is no longer a strategy. It is the sound of a government that has run out of answers for what Iran has done to the country it was elected to protect.